It is just after dark on June 12, 1864, and somewhere in the Virginia night, an entire army is disappearing. 115,000 men, infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineers, supply wagons stretching back 50 miles, are rising from their trenches at Cold Harbor and walking south into the darkness. They leave behind cooking fires still burning, knapsacks propped against logs. The illusion of an army still in place, regimental bands strike up Yankee Doodle at intervals along the line. Not celebration, deception. The music masks the creak of wagon wheels, the clatter of 10,000 canteens, the shuffling of boots through Virginia dust. Somewhere ahead, in swamps that will swallow men to the knee, the road south leads to a river 2,000 feet wide. And on the other side, the end of the war. Grant himself called it a hazardous one. In his memoirs, written decades later as cancer ate his throat, he described the problem plainly. More than 50 miles intervened between me and Butler by the roads I should have to travel. With both the James and the Chickahominy unbridged to cross, he was threading an entire army through a needle, in the dark, in enemy territory. In the time it takes to drive from one end of a mid-sized city to the other, the longest continuous marching column in American military history would pass you. 50 miles of men, horses, cannons, and wagons, and Robert E. Lee, 35 miles away, had no idea any of it was happening. How do you hide 115,000 men from an enemy who was watching you from trenches 50 yards away just hours earlier? How do you march them 35 miles through swamps, build a bridge half a mile long across a tidal river, and cross them to the other side, all without your opponent realizing you have moved? And when Lee finally understood what had happened, what did he actually say? His letters survive. The answer reveals a man who knew he had been beaten. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Grant pulled off the most audacious operational maneuver of the Civil War, and you will read Lee's own words as the truth dawned on him. But to understand the genius of the crossing, you need to understand the desperation that made it necessary. If you are fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, the moments where one commander's brilliance left another groping in the dark, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You will not want to miss what comes next. Now let me take you back to Virginia in the summer of 1864. By June 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was running out of options, and he knew it. He was 42 years old, a tanner's son from Ohio who had washed out of the army once before, failed at farming, failed at selling leather, and been rescued from obscurity only by the accident of civil war. Now he commanded every Union army in the field, and for 6 weeks he had been bleeding men at a rate that horrified even his own staff. Cold Harbor. The name still carried the stench of failure. On June 3rd, Grant had ordered a frontal assault against Lee's entrenched lines. In less than 30 minutes, 7,000 Union soldiers fell. Some pinned their names to their coats before the charge, knowing they would not survive to be identified. Grant, in a rare admission, later wrote, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. He would not make that mistake again." 35 miles away, Robert E. Lee had every reason for confidence. He was 57, a Virginia aristocrat married to the great-granddaughter of George Washington himself. He had been beating Union commanders for 3 years. But in the summer of 1864, he was not the Lee of Chancellorsville. His body was failing, heart disease, chronic back pain, bouts of dysentery that left him grey-faced and exhausted. He commanded from a camp chair when he could not mount his horse. Here is what makes this moment so extraordinary. The man about to execute the most complex military maneuver in American history, threading 115,000 men through 50 miles of enemy territory in total darkness, had, 10 years earlier, been working as a clerk in his father's leather shop in Galena, Illinois, collecting bills, barely making rent. That man was now about to outthink Robert E. Lee. Grant faced a simple, brutal equation. He could not break Lee's lines by frontal assault. Cold Harbor had proved that in blood. He could not outflank Lee to the north. The Chickahominy swamps blocked movement. He could not simply wait. Lincoln faced re-election in November, and if the war looked stalled, the peace Democrats would win and negotiate Confederate independence. Grant needed a move so bold, so unexpected, that Lee would not believe it even as it happened. And Lee's men, they were veterans, 3 years of hard marching and harder fighting. But they were also hungry. Rations had been cut to half the Union standard. Many were conscripts now, teenagers and gray-haired farmers swept up by the Conscription Act of 1862. Private William Fletcher of the 8th Texas Cavalry remembered eating parched corn and sleeping without tents. They had beaten Grant at Cold Harbor. They believed they could beat him again. They were about to discover he had vanished. Grant's plan required moving the entire Army of the Potomac, 5 corps, over 100,000 men, plus elements of Butler's Army of the James. The full force, Warren's 5th Corps, 15,300 men. Hancock's 2nd Corps, the largest at 30,000. Wright's 6th Corps, 20,000. Burnside's 9th Corps, another 20,000. Wilson's Cavalry Division, 6,000 troopers who would screen the march. Behind them, 5,500 supply wagons and 28,000 horses and mules. The route was a nightmare. From Cold Harbor to the James River crossing point at Weyanoke, 35 miles of roads that barely deserved the name. White Oak Swamp, a morass of chest-deep mud and tangled forest. The Chickahominy River, which had to be bridged before the march could even begin. And at the end, the James itself, 2,100 feet wide at Weyanoke Point. Tidal currents running 2 to 4 knots, no existing bridge anywhere within 50 miles. Think about the math for a second. If you lined up 115,000 men single file, 1 yard apart, that line would stretch 65 miles, longer than the distance from New York City to Philadelphia, and Grant was going to march that line through enemy-held swampland, across 2 rivers, and deposit it on the far side of the James, all while Robert E. Lee sat 35 miles away, watching empty trenches and wondering where everyone had gone. Against this force stood Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, roughly 60,000 men, dug into some of the strongest fieldworks ever constructed. A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps held the left, about 20,000. Anderson's 1st Corps, another 20,000, anchored the center and right. They were outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, but behind entrenchments they had proven themselves nearly unbreakable. George Gordon Meade, 48, technically commanded the Army of the Potomac. A Philadelphia engineer by training, he was brilliant at logistics but prickly enough that his own staff called him the old snapping turtle. He had clashed repeatedly with Grant's aides, who treated him as a middle manager rather than an army commander. But for this operation, his engineering mind was essential. The bridging, the roads, the coordination of 5 corps moving simultaneously through swampland at night. Gouverneur K. Warren, 34, led the 5th Corps. A year earlier, he had saved the Union Army at Gettysburg by recognizing that Little Round Top was undefended and rushing troops to hold it. That moment had made his reputation. But since then, he had developed a reputation for hesitation, for seeing problems where others saw opportunities. Grant watched him carefully. Warren's corps would cross first. There would be no room for delay. The scene is Grant's headquarters tent, the evening of June 11th. Grant has just returned from a conference with Benjamin Butler at Dutch Gap, where they discussed the crossing. His staff officers, Porter, Rawlins, Babcock, are present. Maps cover the table. Grant's cigar burns untouched in his hand. The plan is laid out. Disengage from Cold Harbor after dark. March south, cross the Chickahominy, cross the James, link with Butler at Bermuda Hundred. Take Petersburg before Lee understands what has happened. Simple to describe, monstrous to execute. Grant knew what could go wrong. If Lee detected the withdrawal and attacked during the march, with the army strung out over 50 miles of swamp road, the result would be catastrophe. Not just a defeat, The destruction of the Army of the Potomac, the war lost, Lincoln defeated in November, the Confederacy independent. Colonel Horace Porter watched Grant that evening, and later wrote that he had never seen the general so consumed, wrought up to an intensity of thought and action which he seldom displayed. Grant, the man famous for calm under fire, for whittling sticks while shells exploded around him, was nervous, but he gave the order: no debate, no council of war. Grant had learned from too many predecessors that councils of war never fight. He simply decided the army would move on the night of June 12th. Every unit commander received sealed orders. The operation was underway. Whether this moment of decision was truly as solitary as Porter's memoir suggests, we cannot know. Memoirs written 30 years later tend toward clean drama. But the consequence is beyond dispute. Grant committed 115,000 men to a 50-mile march through hostile territory with no fallback position. If it failed, everything failed. Now here is the part that would terrify any general who has ever studied this campaign. For the next 4 days, Grant's army will be completely vulnerable, strung out, split across rivers, unable to concentrate. If Lee finds them, if Lee even suspects, he can strike with his full 60,000 against isolated corps of 15 or 20,000. The result would make Cold Harbor look like a skirmish, and Lee is 35 miles away, with scouts everywhere. On the night of June 12th, the first units began to move. The question was not whether Grant could execute the march. His engineers had solved that problem. The question was whether Lee, the finest tactical mind of the war, would see through the deception in time. The answer would decide the fate of the Confederacy. The cavalry went first. James H. Wilson, 27 years old, an Ohio farmer's son barely 4 years out of West Point, led 6,000 troopers across the Chickahominy River, 15 miles downstream from Cold Harbor. Their job: screen everything behind them. No Confederate patrol could be allowed to see what was coming. Behind Wilson's cavalry, Warren's Fifth Corps rose from their trenches and began walking south. 15,300 men, moving in column through darkness so complete that soldiers held the coat of the man ahead to keep formation. Torchlight was forbidden near the front. Orders passed in whispers. Back at headquarters, Grant was not sleeping. Colonel Horace Porter, his aide-de-camp, recorded the general's state. Grant was wrought up to an intensity of thought and action which he seldom displayed. The man who had kept his composure at Shiloh, at Vicksburg, at the Wilderness, who had famously whittled sticks while under artillery fire, was pacing, chain-smoking, waiting for reports that his army had not been discovered. The diversions kicked in simultaneously. Philip Sheridan's cavalry corps was already 2 days into a raid toward Trevilian Station, a feint designed to pull Confederate cavalry away from the James. Butler's forces at Bermuda Hundred launched probing attacks, and at Dutch Gap, Union engineers continued noisily cutting a canal through a bend in the James River, a project that was, in military terms, utterly pointless, but which had seized Lee's attention completely. The irony is almost unbearable. On June 11th, the day before Grant began his crossing, Robert E. Lee personally visited Dutch Gap to assess the canal-cutting operation. He stood on the bank of the James River. He stared at Union engineers digging in the dirt. He believed this was Grant's plan. He was looking at a distraction. The real operation was about to happen 50 miles to the east, and Lee would not understand this for 4 more days. The men marched through White Oak Swamp in the small hours of June 13th. Warren's report, filed weeks later, described the conditions tersely: crossed Chickahominy at 2 a.m. June 13th marched 20 miles to James. What the official record does not capture is what that march felt like: knee-deep mud, mosquitoes thick as fog, men collapsing from heat exhaustion even in the darkness. The temperature had been in the high 80s during the day, and the swamp held the heat like a furnace with the door closed. Dawn, June 13th. Confederate scouts approached the Cold Harbor trenches and found nothing. Cooking fires reduced to ash, abandoned breastworks, the positions that had held 100,000 Union soldiers were empty. The Army of the Potomac had vanished in the night. Lee received the report and made his assessment. Grant was flanking south, that much was obvious. But toward what? Lee's conclusion. Grant was sidling toward Richmond, using the Chickahominy as cover, aiming to approach the capital from the southeast. It was the logical move. It was what every Union commander before Grant had attempted, and it was completely wrong. Lee wrote urgently to Richard Ewell, his corps commander covering the approaches to Richmond. Discover what the enemy is doing. If we cannot arrest his work, we cannot in other ways counteract his operations. The tone is instructive. Lee is not panicking, not yet. He believes he understands the situation. He is simply asking for confirmation of what he already thinks he knows. But what Lee did not know, what he could not know, was that Grant was not flanking toward Richmond at all. Grant was marching away from Richmond, straight south to the James. The canal at Dutch Gap, the probing attacks at Bermuda Hundred, Sheridan's cavalry raid, all of it was noise. And Lee was listening to the noise while the army slipped past him in silence. Lee shifted his forces. A.P. Hill's Third Corps, 20,000 men, marched south to block the roads between the Chickahominy and the James. Anderson's First Corps moved to cover White Oak Swamp and Malvern Hill. A division posted at Drury's Bluff on the James. All of it pointed toward Richmond. That same day, Lee wrote to Jefferson Davis with confidence. The force, I understand, is engaged in cutting a canal through the neck. He was referring to Dutch Gap. He believed Grant's main effort was a canal. The truth was 35 miles to the east, and 115,000 men were already halfway to the James. Consider what this means. The greatest defensive general of the Civil War, perhaps in American history, received word that the enemy had vanished from his front, and instead of suspecting the worst, he convinced himself he already knew the answer. Lee was not blind. He was worse than blind. He was certain, and certainty, in war, is the most dangerous form of ignorance. On the Confederate side, the confusion filtered down to every level. Private William Fletcher, 8th Texas Cavalry, was with Hill's corps as it shifted south on June 13th. In his memoir, written decades later, he captured the mood perfectly. We were shifted hither and yon, not knowing Grant's game. Fletcher and his comrades marched in brutal heat, 85 degrees, no shade on the Virginia roads. They ate parched corn. They slept without tents. Rumors ran through the column like water. Grant was headed for Richmond. Grant was retreating to the coast. Grant was dead. None of it was true. The only truth was that no one, not Fletcher, not his officers, not Hill, not Lee himself, knew where the Union Army had gone. The men who had beaten Grant at Cold Harbor just 10 days earlier were now chasing a ghost. And the ghost was already at the river. By the evening of June 13th, the lead elements of Grant's army were approaching the James River. Behind them, 50 miles of marching column still snaked through the Virginia countryside. Ahead of them, an engineering challenge that had never been attempted at this scale in American military history. And they had to do it fast, because somewhere behind them, Robert E. Lee was starting to suspect he had been wrong. The James River at Weyanoke Point is not a gentle crossing. 2,100 feet of dark tidal water, wider than 5 football fields laid end to end, currents running 2 to 4 knots, strong enough to drag a loaded pontoon downstream, marshy banks that offered no solid footing for approach roads. And on June 14, 1864, Union engineers looked at this obstacle and began building a bridge across it. They started at 4 in the afternoon. Pontoon boats, flat-bottomed wooden craft, each roughly 30 feet long, were swung into the current and anchored with cables, planking laid across them. More boats. More planking. The bridge grew from the north bank foot by foot, fighting the current with every new section. Let me put this in perspective. The pontoon bridge at Weyanoke Point was 2,100 feet long, that is, 7 football fields. It was built in 8 to 10 hours, in tidal currents strong enough to capsize a small boat, by engineers who had been marching for 2 days without sleep. It remains one of the greatest engineering feats of the Civil War, and it was built in secret, in enemy territory, with a hostile army 35 miles away. Sergeant Rice C. Bull of the 123rd Pennsylvania was among the first infantry to cross. He was 22 years old, a farm boy who had enlisted 2 years earlier and survived more battles than most men twice his age. Years later, he wrote of the experience, "The pontoon bridge was over 2,000 feet long. The current was so swift that it required all the skill of the engineers to keep it in place. Walking it was an act of faith. The bridge swayed and trembled under the weight of thousands of men, horses, and artillery pieces." Bull remembered the feeling, like walking the deck of a ship in a storm, except the ship was half a mile long and there was no railing. Butler had taken a precaution that showed the depth of planning behind the operation. 2 vessels loaded with stone had been pre-sunk upstream of the crossing point, positioned to block any Confederate ironclads from steaming downriver and destroying the bridge. The James River squadron of Confederate warships, including the fearsome CSS Virginia II, was neutralized before it could act. Every contingency had been mapped, every threat anticipated. By midnight on June 14th, the bridge was complete. Wright's 6th Corps had already begun crossing by ferry earlier that day. Now the floodgates opened. Column after column of blue-uniformed infantry stepped onto the swaying pontoons and walked across the James River, and Robert E. Lee, sitting in his headquarters 35 miles to the north, still believed Grant was digging a canal at Dutch Gap. June 15, 1864. The crossing reaches its peak. By this morning, roughly 50,000 Union soldiers have already reached the south bank of the James. Hancock's 2nd Corps, 30,000 men, the largest single formation in the army, begins crossing. The bridge groans under artillery caissons. Horses balk at the swaying planks and have to be blindfolded and led. Behind the infantry comes the logistical tale that makes modern war possible. 5,500 wagons, each pulled by teams of 4 to 6 mules, 28,000 animals in total. The column stretching back from the bridge extends north and east for 50 miles, the longest continuous marching column in United States military history, a single unbroken river of men and material flowing south. More people than lived in any American city except New York, Philadelphia, or Baltimore, all moving as one body across a tidal river. And here is the detail that still astonishes historians 160 years later. This crossing, 115,000 men, 5,500 wagons, 28,000 animals, across a 2,100-foot tidal river, proceeded for 4 full days without detection by the enemy. 4 days, longer than the Battle of Gettysburg lasted. Lee's scouts, his cavalry, his intelligence network, all of it failed. The largest army in the Western Hemisphere moved 50 miles through enemy territory, crossed 2 major rivers, and arrived on the south bank of the James without a single Confederate commander understanding what was happening until it was far too late. The heat was savage. June in Virginia, temperatures pushing 90 degrees, humidity that turned the air to soup. Men who had marched all night collapsed in the shade of their own wagons. Dust clouds rose from the column and hung motionless in the still air. The engineers worked in shifts, repairing pontoon sections that loosened in the current, re-anchoring boats that dragged their cables. But the machine did not stop. It could not stop. Every hour of delay was an hour in which Lee might discover the truth. Grant, cigar clenched between his teeth, stationed at Windmill Point overlooking the crossing, watched his army pour across the river and knew that time was the enemy now, not Lee. The supply base was shifting to City Point, at the confluence of the James and Appomattox rivers. Once established there, the army could sustain itself indefinitely. But until that link was secure, the full weight of 115,000 men dangled at the end of a 50-mile supply line with no fallback. The ferries worked alongside the bridge, flat-bottomed barges that could carry entire companies across in a single trip. Wright's Corps completed its crossing. Burnside's 9th Corps moved into position. The schedule held. The deception held. By the evening of June 15th, more than 100,000 Union soldiers stood on the south bank of the James River. Petersburg, the rail junction that supplied Lee's entire army, lay just 10 miles to the south, and its garrison numbered fewer than 5,000 men. Meanwhile, 35 miles north of the James Crossing, Robert E. Lee is fighting shadows. His scouts bring contradictory reports. His cavalry is scattered. He knows Grant has moved, but where? Richmond, the coast, the James. Lee, the man who read McClellan like a book, who predicted Hooker's every move at Chancellorsville, who outthought Pope and Burnside and every other Union commander sent against him. This Lee cannot find 115,000 men. They have, in Fletcher's words, vanished like smoke. On the Confederate side, Private Fletcher felt the confusion viscerally. His unit marched and countermarched in the heat, sent first toward one road, then another. The officers knew nothing, the men knew less. The only certainty was uncertainty. June 13th, Lee shifts forces toward Richmond, believing Grant is flanking the capital. Wrong. June 14th, Lee receives no new intelligence that contradicts his assumption. His cavalry, depleted by Sheridan's raid, cannot locate Grant's main body. Lee maintains his position. Still wrong. June 15th, Confederate scouts report Union activity near the James River, but the reports are fragmentary, contradictory. Lee considers the possibility of a crossing but does not commit forces south toward Petersburg. He is waiting for confirmation that never comes, because Grant's operational security is near perfect. June 16th, finally, reports reach Lee that confirm a massive Union presence south of the James. The crossing is not a feint. It is not a diversion. It is the entire Army of the Potomac. Lee understands too late that Grant has stolen a march of 4 days and 35 miles. Petersburg, the key to Richmond's supply lines, is under immediate threat. Lee begins rushing forces south, but he is 48 hours behind. The race for Petersburg has already been lost, not on the battlefield, but in the 4 days of silence when Lee looked one direction while Grant moved in another. By June 16th, the vanguard of Grant's army is already probing Petersburg's defenses. The city is held by a skeleton force under PGT. Beauregard, barely 5,000 men behind hastily reinforced earthworks. Against them, over 100,000 Union troops, with Hancock's massive column arriving first. What should have been a quick Union victory dissolved into confusion, missed opportunities, and broken coordination. Hancock arrived without clear orders. Smith's 18th Corps attacked late on June 15th and captured sections of the outer line but failed to exploit the breakthrough. By the time Grant's full force concentrated, Beauregard had scraped together 14,000 defenders from every available source, and Lee's reinforcements were finally on their way. But that is a different story. The tragedy of the Petersburg assaults, where Union advantage evaporated through hesitation and miscommunication. What matters here is this. Grant had achieved the impossible. He had moved an army of 115,000 men across 50 miles of enemy territory, bridged a river half a mile wide, and arrived at his objective with a 4-day head start on the finest general of his era. The fact that subordinates fumbled the advantage at Petersburg does not diminish the achievement of the crossing itself. The operational maneuver was complete. The strategic result was irreversible. Lee was now pinned at Petersburg. The siege would last 9 months, and the Confederacy's last hope of winning the war through maneuver, through the brilliant defensive warfare that had sustained it for 3 years, was over. When the last units crossed and the pontoon bridge was dismantled on June 18th, the final accounting was staggering. Over the course of 4 days, 96 hours, 105,000 infantry, 13,000 cavalry, 4,000 artillerymen, 5,500 wagons, and 28,000 animals had crossed the James River. Union casualties during the entire operation, negligible. A handful of skirmishes with Confederate cavalry patrols. No major engagement. No discovery. The most vulnerable moment in the history of the Army of the Potomac, strung out over 50 miles with no ability to concentrate, passed without a single Confederate attack. This is the moment the Civil War changed. Not with a battle, not with a charge or a last stand or a heroic sacrifice. The Civil War changed in silence, in the creak of pontoon boats, the shuffle of boots on planking, the scratch of engineers' pencils calculating current and load. Grant did not defeat Lee at the James River. He made Lee irrelevant, and Lee knew it. When the truth reached Lee on June 16th and 17th, the response was not the calm strategic adjustment of earlier campaigns. His letters from this period reveal something closer to bewilderment. Private Fletcher captured the Confederate rank-and-file reaction in 3 words. Grant vanished like smoke. Lee had been outmaneuvered, not tactically, but operationally. He had committed the cardinal sin of generalship. He had assumed he understood his enemy's intentions, and he had been completely wrong. The canal at Dutch Gap, the diversions at Bermuda Hundred, Sheridan's cavalry raid, all of it had worked precisely as Grant intended. Lee had watched the magician's left hand while the right hand performed the trick. So what did Lee actually say when he realized Grant had crossed the James without detection? His surviving correspondence from June 13th through the 17th tells the story in stages. On June 13th, still confident, the force I understand is engaged in cutting a canal through the neck. He is calm. He believes he knows. On June 14th, to Ewell, the tone shifts. Discover what the enemy is doing. If we cannot arrest his work, we cannot in other ways counteract his operations. This is a man beginning to suspect he has made an error. The language, discover, cannot reveals uncertainty where there should be certainty. By June 16th and 17th, when the full picture emerged, Lee's communications to Davis and his corps commanders become urgent, stripped of the measured prose that characterized his earlier letters. He orders immediate movement south. He demands cavalry reconnaissance. He is, for perhaps the first time in the war, reacting rather than acting, following rather than leading. The great defensive genius of the Confederacy had been reduced to chasing Grant's shadow, 4 days and 35 miles too late. How did Grant hide 115,000 men? The answer is not one trick, but many. Night marches with no torchlight, bands playing to mask movement sounds. Sheridan's diversionary raid pulling Confederate cavalry away, Butler's attacks at Bermuda Hundred fixing attention, the Dutch Gap Canal giving Lee something visible but meaningless to focus on, and operational security so tight that even many Union Corps commanders did not know the full plan until they received sealed orders. Why did Lee not attack during the crossing? Because he never knew it was happening. His cavalry was scattered. His scouts were misled. And his own assumptions that Grant would flank toward Richmond, as every predecessor had, blinded him to the truth. Lee was not incompetent. He was human, and Grant had planned for exactly that humanity. Grant arrived at City Point on June 15th and established his new headquarters, the nerve center from which he would direct the final year of the war. He had vindicated his reputation, silenced the critics who called him a butcher after the butcher's bill at Cold Harbor, and executed a maneuver that military historians would study for the next century and a half. The former leather clerk from Ohio had outthought the aristocrat from Virginia. Lee settled into Petersburg's defenses and would not leave them for 9 months. The war of maneuver was over. What replaced it was siege, grinding, industrial, inevitable. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which had thrived on mobility and audacity, was now pinned to a trench line. The thing Lee feared most, a siege he could not win, had become reality. Warren, the hero of Little Round Top who crossed first, would continue serving until Grant relieved him at Five Forks in April 1865, unfairly, most historians believe. He spent his remaining years trying to clear his name. He died in 1882, still bitter, never having received the court of inquiry he demanded. The James River crossing was over. The guns had barely spoken. No monument marks the spot where an army crossed in secret. No famous painting depicts the moment. But the battle's end was just the beginning of a siege, a surrender, and a century of argument over what it all meant. The crossing of the James led directly to the siege of Petersburg, 9 months of trench warfare that presaged the Western Front of 1914. Lee, pinned to his defenses, could no longer maneuver. His army bled out slowly through attrition, desertion, and starvation. When the lines finally broke on April 2, 1865, Lee had fewer than 35,000 men. A week later, at Appomattox Courthouse, he surrendered to Grant. The war that had claimed 750,000 lives ended in a parlor, with 2 tired old soldiers, though neither was actually old, signing papers at a small wooden table. Grant's crossing has been called the most brilliant operation of the war by historians from Bruce Catton to James McPherson. And Grant himself, in his memoirs, presented it as a clean triumph of planning over reaction. But the full truth is more complicated. The crossing was undetected. Yes, but the exploitation was botched. The initial attacks on Petersburg, which should have captured the city on June 15th and 16th, failed through a cascade of miscommunication, timidity, and exhaustion. Grant delivered his army to the enemy's doorstep with a 4-day head start, and his subordinates squandered it. The brilliance of the crossing makes the failure at Petersburg all the more painful. Here is something most accounts leave out. Lee was not simply fooled. He partially fooled himself. His own reconnaissance on June 11th to Dutch Gap had confirmed his assumption that Grant's main effort was the canal. When his scouts reported activity near the James on June 14th and 15th, he dismissed it as secondary because he had seen the canal work with his own eyes. Lee's personal visit to Dutch Gap, intended to gather intelligence, actually reinforced his misunderstanding. The general who rode out to see the truth saw only what he expected. His own diligence became the instrument of his deception. On the night of June 12, 1864, an army vanished from its trenches at Cold Harbor, cooking fires still burning, knapsacks propped against logs. By the time Robert E. Lee understood what had happened, 115,000 men stood on the south bank of the James, and the war was already decided. Grant wrote later, "The problem was to get the army over the James River without the enemy knowing it. He solved it, not with brilliance in the romantic sense, not with the flash of Lee at Chancellorsville or Jackson in the Valley. He solved it with logistics, with planning, with engineers driving pontoon boats into tidal currents at 4 in the morning, the unglamorous genius of making 115,000 men move as one body through darkness. Sometimes the greatest victory is the one no one sees." The James River still flows past Weyanoke Point. The banks are quiet now. No bridge, no wagons, no army. Just the current, running 2,100 feet wide, the same as it was in June 1864, when an entire army walked across it and changed the world. If this story moved you, subscribe for more.